Mr. President, 4 weeks ago, I stood here on the floor of the Senate to call for increased funding to fight fires. This is just one of the dramatic pictures of Oregon ablaze. Thousands and thousands of acres. I had the experience of driving roughly 350 miles in my state and never escaping the smoke from the fires that were in every single corner, every quadrant of the state of Oregon. We have seen the challenge of Mother Nature at work this year. Hurricanes Harvey and Irma and Maria hitting in Texas and Florida and Puerto Rico. But let's not forget the damage, the incredible damage being done in Montana and Idaho and Oregon and Washington by these extraordinary fires. Over the last decade, we've seen an average of 50,000 fires in America each year, and they destroy, burn up more than 5 million acres. But this year, the count is well over 8 million acres and counting. In Oregon, we normally have fires that burn, on average, about 500,000 acres. But this year, we're well over 600,000 acres and counting. So, as a result of these raging fires, we have many communities that have been so powerfully impacted, and so many forests so destructively impacted. We should stop and ask, what can we do to do better in terms of our forests and our communities? And that's why I'm taking to the floor right now. The first thing we need to do is end fire borrowing. This is where the U.S. Forest Service, in order to pay for fighting these fires, proceeds to borrow from every other account. This has become all too common. And what are those other accounts? They're the Hazardous Fuels Fund and the Forest Management Fund, Forest Restoration Funds, Forest Conservation, and road maintenance funds, and funds that are designed to prepare for future timber sales. All of that does a lot of damage to the preparation so that the forests are more resilient and aren't susceptible to this type of intensive fire. We've seen, on average in the last decade, a cost of fighting fires across the country of about $1.6 billion. But this year, we're over $3 billion, almost double. So even though the Appropriations Committee had wisely put in a buffer of several $100 million to prevent fire borrowing, those funds were long ago wiped out. So there we were 4 weeks ago. I was working to say, now that we are over the allotted funds for the year, let's immediately get more funds that can be used to backfill this shortage in September. And I thank all my colleagues for the fact that those funds were included in the continuing resolution, and we successfully provided a bridge so that firefighting could continue and so that the fire borrowing was quickly repaid. But that is not a permanent solution to try to legislate, to backfill on a rapid basis. Indeed, when we have these kinds of fire seasons, it's like other natural disasters. It's like tornadoes and hurricanes and floods. And so we need to have a FEMA-style backup for those worst ever fire seasons. And that's what my colleagues, Senator Wyden and Senator Crapo, bipartisan teamwork, have been putting forth. And it's called the Wildfire Disaster Funding Act of 2017. And it says when we reach a certain level of funding for fighting fires, the rest, the balance, will go to a FEMA-style fund. That's exactly the way it should be done. It's been estimated in the past that if just the top 1 or 2% of the worst fires were funded in a FEMA-style fund, we've never had fire borrowing in the past. But the most relevant, kind of crisp and clean way to do that would be to adopt this bill that Senator Wyden and Senator Crapo have put so much work into, and that I'm certainly pleased to sponsor. So that would be very useful, and we should do that now. We should respond while the memory is fresh, and actually while fires are still burning in state after state, certainly burning in my home state of Oregon. But then we should recognize, too, that this terrible fire year has done so much damage to so many communities. We have communities where the roads have been cut off. We have communities where the tourists disappeared because of the smoke, or other enterprises, economic enterprises, had to shut down for an extended period. So as we assist those communities hit by Harvey and hit by Irma and hit by Maria, let's also help those communities that were hit by this year's extraordinary fires. That would mean strengthening the Small Business Disaster Loan Program. That would mean taking the additional funding for the USDA Emergency Community Water System Program. And certainly it would mean making additional community development block grants available to the communities that have been impacted by these fires. So let's not forget those communities as we provide assistance and funding to the communities affected by the hurricanes. Then we also need to address the fact that many assets in our forests were scorched by these fires. Trails that have to be repaired, roads that have to be repaired, watershed repairs to avoid landslides, facilities that were scorched and burned, wildlife and fish management restoration, including critical sage-grouse areas. I was up visiting the incredible waterfall, Multnomah Falls, and there they were explaining that several of the trails have bridges, as there are so many bridges on the trails in Oregon, and that the fire had burned some of the understructure. So from above, it looked like the bridge was safe, but they weren't safe, and they can't reopen those trails until they get support to do all this repair. And the Forest Service has estimated that it will take $150 million to restore the damage done to the Forest Service's infrastructure. So we should make that happen as part of this bill. And then we should turn to forest fire resilience. You know, we have 2 million acres in need of fire prevention efforts in Oregon. Actually, we have far more of that in need of fire prevention, but we have nearly 2 million that have already passed through environmental approval for work to reduce the hazardous fuels that are on the floor of the forest and to thin these forests. You can imagine that when you have clear cuts and those clear cuts are replanted, the trees grow back very close together, and in a short amount of time, those forests are very, very good for fires, very good for disease, but they are neither good for ecosystems or for timber stands, so they have to be thinned. And that thinning can be done in Oregon alone on nearly 2 million acres already approved through the environmental process. The challenge is to get more funds into that effort. And so that too should be part of this, because whether you talk to an environmentalist or whether you talk to somebody who wants saw logs for the mills, they both know that if you thin these forests, you make them more resistant to fire, better timber stands, better ecosystems, and you supply a steady supply of saw logs to the mill. So it's a win-win. Let's not reopen the timber wars of the past. Let's work together with a win-win. I want to show this chart because it indicates the dramatic change of what's happened to the Forest Service budget. If we go back to 1995 and compare it to the year 2015, I want to focus particularly on the orange. The orange is the amount of money that was spent fighting forest fires. So 20 years ago, it was 16% of the Forest Service budget. But today, in 2015, 2 years ago, it broke 50%. It was 52% of their budget. And this year, it's certainly gone up much higher than that. So as the amount of funds spent on fighting fires has increased, it has dramatically reduced the amount of funds that support our maintenance and improvement of the forest. And so that's what's getting squeezed out. Now let me put it differently. The more you spend fighting fires out of a single pot of money, the less money you have to prevent the fires. Everywhere I go, I say, can't we do more on the front end so that these forests are more resilient? If you think about how fire works, it really gets going if the trees are close together, because one tree lights the next tree on fire. So if you thin them, you slow that down. And it goes from the ground where there's brush to the canopy where there are branches very easily if the branches are close to the ground. So you trim off those branches, separate the trees, thin them out, shave off the branches, cut off the branches, and suddenly you have a forest that is much more resilient. Now there are those folks who have said, you know, let's just get rid of the environmental rules, let's just go and clear cut everything, let's do 10,000 acres at a time, that's, by the way, 15 square miles, let's set those 15 square miles next to each other, let's just shave the earth, wipe out the forests, and that way there won't be forest fires. That's the timber wars of the past. What we have seen is we can bridge the divide between good ecosystem, good timber stand, by thinning the forest, by making them more like a natural forest, much more fire resilient. And in the process of thinning, which has to be done periodically over time, also providing a steady foundation for saw logs for our mills. There's a mill in John Day, Oregon, and I met with the folks there who were very worried, the workers there who were very worried about that mill getting shut down. And I was determined to do everything I could to save that mill. And what ended up happening is we found we couldn't save that mill with a timber sale because a timber sale can't commit to a flow of logs over a 10-year period. And the owner of the mill couldn't commit to the cost of new machinery if he didn't know that he'd get logs for an extended period of time. So we discovered we could, though, through a forest health contract, through a stewardship contract, enable a steady supply of thinned logs to make it to that mill and make sure that mill stayed open. And not only did it keep it open, but it added workers to that mill. That's the type of win-win solution that we need. We have seen another way of looking at this cost of fighting fires here. We see 1995, 16% of the budget going to fight fires. 2017, 56%. But let's look into the future. It's estimated, and originally the estimate was we'd reach 67% by 2025. Now the new estimate, based on the changing dynamics in the forest, is we will hit over 2/3 of the budget fighting fires by the year 2021, 4 fire seasons from today. That's how big the issue is. That's why we need funds for the front end to be able to thin these forests. This is just simply common sense. If you were the private owner of a private forest, you wouldn't dare let this forest retain this high propensity to fires and disease. You would thin the forest. You would make it a better timber stand. You'd make it a better ecosystem. And that's what we need to do. We've also seen that another way of looking at the changes is how the staffing levels have changed over the last 2 decades. If we look just 2 decades ago, we can see that there were, in 1998, about 18,000 individuals dedicated to managing the forest lands, and just 5,700 dedicated to going out and fighting blazes. But now we come into the future, and we see that now the number of people fighting fires is larger than the number working on all the other forest programs. So we have to commit to doing far more on the prevention end. If we let this summer's crisis go without securing funding to thin those forests that have already gone through the environmental process, we're making a huge mistake, and it's going to cost us more because the fires are going to be even more in the future. And so not only will we spend more out of the national treasury to fight them, but we'll have less healthy timber stands to fuel our economy. So, Mr. President, let's end the fire borrowing. Let's provide the funding to restore the Forest Service assets that were burned, the scorched assets. Let's provide assistance through community development block grants and small business loans to assist the communities that were scorched by these fires. Let's pass Senator Wyden and Senator Crapo's bill, which proceeds to create a FEMA-like structure to back up the worst fire seasons. And certainly, absolutely, let's invest in prevention on the front end by thinning these forests and getting the flammable buildup of forest branches off the floor of the forest. Those are positive things we can do. At this moment, in Houston, in Miami, Puerto Rico, people are thinking, what can we do to be better prepared for the next storm surge? What can we do to be better prepared for the next hurricane? Well, we know for sure that we're going to have fires across the Northwest, in Montana and Idaho and Oregon and Washington every summer, and that they're simply getting worse. We must ask ourselves the same question. How do we change this rhythm? How do we operate differently and better? That's our responsibility in this chamber, and that's the set of things that we can do to have a far better outcome in the future. And I urge all of my colleagues to support these 5 efforts as we support funding for Texas and Florida and Puerto Rico. Thank you, Mr. President.